In a world where even the smallest disagreements can lead to arguments, violence, and even death, two brothers tackle the difficult subjects.
Today, we're going to talk about the Twitter files. Uh, so, what is your if we go back to the beginning of all that stuff? What is your understanding of how it came about and what it is? Or do you want me to cover that so you can chew?
I'm okay.
Okay.
Um, so my understanding is that when he took over, he chose a number of journalists and then gave them a dump of information. And it seemed from what the journalists were saying and what he was saying that it wasn't as if they had free reign of the organization where they just went in and started, picking through everything and just picking and choosing what they wanted. It was somewhat curated, in fact, for them. In fact, at one point, was the guy, I think it was Jim Baker, was the guy that used to work for the FBI, and he was still the legal counsel for Twitter, and they were getting some of the information through him. I think he was subsequently let go or something like that, or fired. But anyway, I guess it wasn't as open and transparent as it could have been. I don't know. Maybe it would be better if it were open and transparent, but you kind of understand why maybe they didn't want that. I don't know what their motivations were, but so anyway. But then there were a number of people like Matt Taibbi, Barry Weiss, Michael Schellenberger, who I like a lot, that went through, and other guys and other people that went through that information, kind of gave a download of what they had found, and it was just sort of through their prism of understanding, or because first it was curated in what was given to them, and then it was, as any news story is, then they presented what they thought was the most important. But then they gave some information about a lot of different things about the FBI's involvement in some of the um, controlling of stories that came out of Twitter. They gave some of the methodologies that were used to reduce the reach of certain Twitter users and certain stories. Anyways, I thought it was pretty interesting, but that's my understanding. Is that a pretty good synopsis?
Yeah, and so I heard an interview with Barry Weiss and Michael Schellenberger, and they were talking about the process, and they said in some ways it's more than they would normally get because they would submit a query to someone that had access to the databases, and they would say, for example, give me all communications that might mention Mar-a-Lago subpoena. And so then anything that came out from within the organization, within Twitter, that was mentioned in emails, that was mentioned in the Slack channels, that contained the words or phrases that they put out there. And then they would go and they'd filter through. And they said that at the beginning, when this Baker character was there, they felt like information wasn't coming through, and so they felt like it was being filtered. But since he was removed from the process, they said it seemed like they were getting everything. There was not the impression that anything was being left out. The challenge with that process, though, is that while they have access to anything that's put forward in electronic communications, if they found something particularly interesting, they couldn't then go and ask the individual, I see you were involved in this exchange. Can you give me more insight? Were there conversations happening outside of this communication stream that would have been useful? What was your reasoning for doing this? So in some ways, it was very insightful. In some ways, it was difficult to work with. And the other aspect to it was that it was presented rather than in a long form, it was presented in tweet format. So a bunch of broken up tweets. And as I mentioned to you last week, I'd found that one site where they had listed everything. The link that I have, first of all, picks out the highlights, so you don't have to go through the whole thing if you don't want to, but then it also links to the entire chain of tweets, so you could look at it from beginning to end, which was much more useful, because when you try and search it on Twitter, it's chaos. It's a nightmare. Twitter isn't really designed for that sort of long form content like that. So it was easier for me. Anything on that? Good.
I think some of those guys, like Schellenberger and others, they put out stories not on Twitter, but in other places where it was more of a long, like a Substack article or something like that, where they tried to summarize it and put it all together. So
okay, good. Yeah, I was having trouble finding any of that, so I'm glad to know that that's out there. So the Twitter, one of the things, like the big, and maybe you'll feel like there was something bigger, but I feel like one of the big pieces of information that came out was that a lot of money was paid to the FBI. $3.4 million paid to the FBI on a particular date, and this was an email, and so then this was where it created a lot of outside interest in the FBI, how they were interacting with Twitter, what their involvement was, how much oversight they had, how much influence they had within Twitter, which was all based more or less. Well, there was more to it than just that, but that was the big thing, was that FBI was paying Twitter for some of their interactions. Do you want to start there, or is there someplace else you want to begin?
Yeah, we can start there. I don't know if that was the biggest revelation, but it certainly was a big one. You said originally they paid the FBI, but I think you meant, and you kind of clarified it later, the FBI paid Twitter, and it seemed like they were paying them to because they were taking so much of their time. There was a direct line of communication between certain FBI, I don't know if operatives is the right word, individuals and offices, where they were communicating directly with some Twitter employees. They were taking a lot of time, and because of that, they reimbursed them for the time that they reimbursed Twitter for the employees' time that they were using, if that makes sense. And yeah, I think that was certainly concerning. First of all, that they would be involved in this type of thing at all. Second, that they would pay for it. It was just an odd thing. The whole situation was very odd to me. I thought it was pretty inappropriate that both Twitter would allow it to happen and that the FBI would want to do that sort of a thing,
Now, okay, so I think this is a good place to begin, because there was depending on which side of the conversation you align with, there was either a lot to make of it or there was not much to make of it. And so the actual languaging is in the Twitter is that the Twitter retains the statutory right of reimbursement for the cost of processing requests. And that was noted on the check, which was the payment was a reimbursement for Twitter for processing legal requests. And then Musk claimed in a tweet that the payment is proof of the U.S. government bribing the company to censor info from the public. That was the content of his tweet, and that was where a lot of people on the right went with this revelation.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, it's an odd position for them to be in. Meaning, well, both the FBI and Twitter. That the FBI would be going and paying this money to that's a fair amount of money. And you can say that it's going to the fact of calling it a bribe. I don't know. That seems a little bit over the top to me. But it does seem very inappropriate. I mean, first of all, and I've said, you and I have talked about this a fair amount. To me, Twitter and social media companies should be a bit of an open forum or a town square where people can come and have their say. And when I say that is what it should be, I'm not saying that the government should regulate it as such. I mean, those companies, as I've said from the first, can do whatever they want. But I think they've kind of represented themselves to be that. And I think that's the best use case for them, because otherwise, I would differentiate between these social media companies and a legacy media company, or even a new media company like I don't know what if you call it the Daily Wire or Breitbart or Huffington Post or whatever. These that are kind of new media. They're not the old ones like NBC, CBS, Fox News, and all of those, CNN. But they are different. The social media companies are different than all these media companies because they're just saying to people, "Hey, come and say what you want." Now, when the government steps in, like I mean, and in a similar way that when the government, if the government were to step in, for example, and say to the New York Times, "Hey, you shouldn't be printing that," or "We want to control your stories," they should just stay out of that. It's not their responsibility. I don't think they should be involved in that at all. And even more so on a social media company like this, because people are having their say. It's a town square, and the government should not be involved in that. So while it may not be a bribe per se, they just shouldn't be doing it. And the fact that they were paying, that they were doing it so much that they had to pay Twitter to the tune of $3.5 million, like that creates some, what would you say? That creates some incentive for Twitter to do more for the FBI than they're supposed to. They're becoming a paying customer. So I do think it's very inappropriate. And bribe may be far-fetched, but it's not far off.
Well, I mean, that's like saying when you go to buy food at a restaurant, you're bribing the restaurant. I mean, if you're paying for service, it's not, I don't know, call it a bribe.
Right, but when you're at a restaurant, I mean, that'd be like saying, well, I can go make huge donations to a politician, and I'm not paying for service. I'm just making donations to their campaign, and I'm not bribing the restaurant. I'm not bribing the politician, but it's certainly going to have an effect. So while it may not be the same as a bribe, it's not the same as paying for a service at a restaurant.
Well, because okay, I mean, you're not getting a product necessarily like a meal, but if you are paying someone for a service, if they are occupying, if the FBI, and we need to be very clear here about, because sometimes we talk government very broad, but we're talking specifically about the FBI right now, and in some of the Twitter files, the FBI was representing other organizations within the government's other law enforcement organizations. But if the FBI is taking up their time, just like a lawyer is going to charge you for their time, Twitter would expect to be compensated for their time as well. And so what was not clear, and what really hasn't been clarified, was there was no itemization of that check or an invoice that was sent off to the FBI. And so if the FBI is paying, for example, to say, we have some accounts that are some Twitter accounts that we feel like might be problematic. Maybe they're white nationalists. Maybe they're spreading some hate. We want to find out who the owners of these accounts are. So that would be a service the FBI might have an interest in, where they're not necessarily influencing or pressuring Twitter to label tweets in a certain way. There are reasons why law enforcement would have an interest in some of what's going on in Twitter and having information that maybe is on the back end. I don't know how much of it would require a subpoena, how much it would require a government or a court oversight. This is a little beyond my my scope of knowledge, but there are reasons other than influencing Twitter to put pressure on certain posts that are actually legitimate.
Do you think then? So it sounds like if they saw that there was misinformation, then they should go to Twitter and put pressure on them to suppress those posts.
Misinformation? I mean, but we don't know that that's actually what they were doing. But we don't know that that's what the money was for.
Anything dangerous, like if they see somebody that's in it that's dangerous, or that they see as a threat, then you think that they should go in and say, hey, we want some information from you to investigate these people, and we also want you to suppress. Oh, you're saying you don't know if they I mean, it was clear in the Twitter files that they asked to suppress some of those accounts and some of those stories.
There were cases that was happening, and there was definitely cases where the FBI was overstepping its purview. Because if they're asking a private corporation to go and change their policies, but there's also, most of the time when the FBI was suggesting that the Twitter look at the accounts. All the screenshots that I saw, that where the FBI was contacting Twitter, FBI requesting the contact be examined because they believe it violates Twitter's policies or terms of service, including misinformation regarding voting place and time. Some screenshots of takedown requests were from the elected officials on Trump's State Department. So there was a mixture, and I don't, from what the ones that I saw, there may be others. The ones that I saw, FBI was not asking Twitter to remove posts. They were just saying, we need you to look at these because we feel like it violates your some of your policies.
They were asking them to suppress posts and to suspend certain users.
Were they saying this is what we want it done, or were they saying we want you to look at these users and these posts because we believe they violate your terms of service? In other words, were they asking for action, or were they suggesting investigation?
I think a little bit of both. I mean, that's where you get this, you say, well, we're just paying for a service. You're going to be a little bit more willing to, if you have a paying customer, to the tune of $3.5 million, you're going to be a little bit more willing to do what they ask you to do. Not to mention that they're also carrying a pretty big stick because they're the federal government. I think that's it seems like you're glossing over a bit the issues that people are really concerned about. When you have a customer come into the restaurant and they're paying you for the meal, then you're going to really try to give them what they want, because they're a paying customer, especially if they are buying a huge meal. Like if they're saying, hey, I've got a whole bunch of people, or they're a big tipper or whatever, you're going to be pretty inclined to try to give them what they want. When the federal government comes in, and not only are they paying you $3.5 million, but they also are the federal government. And there's some implied threat there. Because anytime we deal with the federal government, there is an implied threat because we know the power that they have. It's like dealing with the police. Like, oh, I haven't done anything wrong. Like, you're still a little bit nervous when the police pull up next. I was just in the parking lot the other day. I came out of Home Depot, and I had to pay for something and show them my receipt. And I get out of the parking lot, and I'm in my truck, and I jump down, and there's a policeman standing. I was right between our two vehicles. I didn't even realize there was a police car, but there's a policeman standing there looking right at me with his hand on his gun. And I'm like, whoa, you kind of surprised me there. Not because I was guilty. I had done nothing wrong.
Sure.
But don't tell me there's not some sort of an implied threat there when there's a guy with a gun on his hip and the gun and his hand is on the gun. And the FBI, when they're coming and dealing with you, yeah, that's different than dealing with some company that's paying you $3.5 million. It's the federal government. So you try to give them what they want. And if they say, you should look into this because this is misinformation, that's different than somebody off the street saying, hey, you should look into this guy. The federal government carries a much bigger stick. So to act like there's not some implied threat there is a little bit crazy to me.
Well, maybe your reaction to the cop had to do with your history.
That was probably part of it. But I don't think anybody, you talk with anybody who's driving and then they see the lights go on behind them, like, oh. I mean, that's just the way people are. Everybody's nervous about that.
And you see a cop up in front, you're driving down the road, without even looking at your speedometer, we all slow down a little bit.
I'll slow down a little bit. And if you're pulling out and you see a cop, like the other day I was pulling out of this parking lot, there was a cop waiting at the light there. I'm like, should I just turn right and let this guy go? Like, I'm probably fine. Like, he could see something. Like there's a little bit of concern that comes in there. So to act like there's not, and I'm not saying implied threat, like they're using it to say, hey, you need to do what we want necessarily, but there is an implied threat there. It's different than dealing with McDonald's Corporation or somebody else.
I mean, you're right, but the problem here is what you're saying, and what a lot of people, Fox News and other people are saying, is we don't have evidence of wrongdoing, but hey, they're the FBI. There's probably wrongdoing. I mean, and that's not really fair to go and accuse people of a crime when just saying because of the relationship there must be a crime.
Well, I think that in the Twitter files, they gave specific examples of, look, here's some stories that they asked to suppress, and they turned out to be true later. I think you should address those particular stories. Like if they're making clear, it's not just that people are saying, hey, there was money paid and that's it. And hey, they're the federal government, so that's enough. They're presenting particular instances where they asked to suppress certain stories and it was incorrect to do so. I mean, that's what the Twitter files are all about. So if you want to say, well, the Twitter files don't have anything, I think you have to go to the claims that they're making and then uh, and then address those claims and say, well, this is baseless or something else. I mean, we started out with, hey, you were kind of trying to. It felt to me as if you were trying to say, well, listen, it doesn't matter that they're the federal government. That, and I was trying to say, well, there's an implied threat there. There's something there. And then you were trying to say, well, and it doesn't matter they paid them $3.5 million because they're just paying for a service. Yeah, but when the government's asking you to suppress stuff, I mean, their whole point was to track down Twitter users that they thought were risky and to suppress stories. Well, I think that, if you're paying $3.5 million, like the federal government will be involved in that just seems odd to people, because I think a lot of people feel that this should be an open town square where, yeah, if you find that somebody is threatening people's livelihood or doxing people, giving away their personal information or their addresses, that's concerning. But if people make a statement that, even if it's wrong, let's say it's untrue, they have every right to say that. That's freedom of speech. Now, I get there's a distinction between, everything on Twitter is not necessarily freedom of speech, but it's an open town square. That's what they purport to be. That's what they've always purported to be. And then to see that the federal government was going in and very surreptitiously paying $3.5 million and then asking for certain things to be suppressed, that is concerning to people. And I understand why it is.
Yeah, it is, but I also think that people are connecting. Correlation is not causation. To go to that old cliche. Yes, there is the possibility, but I don't think it's really fair to accuse anybody of a crime until you actually have evidence of a crime. And correlation is not a crime. But there were situations where you had politicians. There was Angus King from Maine, Democrat, either Schiff or Schumer. One of the Democrats was giving a list of Twitter accounts to Twitter that they wanted the users suspended, and it turned out that the user they were accusing them of being Russian bots and other things, or using violent language, and it turned out they were just supporters of their opponents. So there totally was some inappropriate activities going on. Now, there also wasn't clear if Twitter actually followed through and suspended those accounts, but there were some politicians that were pushing for some inappropriate activity. There was also a screenshot of the embattled head of the ethics department, Yale, whatever his name is. I can't remember his name right now. But
Yoel something.
Yeah, that's the one of him. It was an email that he sent to somebody. He says, "Hey, I just received a message from, I think it was the FBI or whatever. It really feels like that what they're asking us to do is going well beyond what we should be doing. Let's go and look into this to see if So there was some pushback from Twitter. Just the fact that they were getting some of the money was not sufficient for them to go and be at the beck and call of the FBI or in any of the other law enforcement agencies that the FBI was representing. So there was evidence that things were inappropriate. There's a lot of speculation that things were, really bad, without a whole lot of evidence that things were really bad, but definitely things were inappropriate.
But Brian, I think the distinction that you're making here is, some people are saying it's really bad that they were involved at all. It's really bad that whatever the reason was, I mean, let's say it wasn't completely malicious that they, the $3.5 million that they spent there. I don't think it was completely malicious, but let's say it wasn't completely malicious. It's still wrong. They shouldn't be doing it. So you're kind of saying, well, they don't have good evidence that something really bad happened. And I think you're talking past the people on the other side that are saying the fact that they were even involved, that they took so much of Twitter's time, that they paid $3.5 million is really bad. So maybe we could, or maybe we can just agree to disagree there. I don't know. But to me, as I said before, and I don't think we've really addressed this should be an open town square where people can say what they want. And the government, I mean, let's give a different example. Would you be okay with the federal government paying $3.5 million to the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or the New York Times because they want to, control information that's coming out of there? Or is it just because it's not journalists?
So the distinction, though, is what you said. Give $3.5 million to control information. And that's really what the problem is, because we don't know what the FBI was doing. There was, when all of this came out, one of the things that happened was that people were asking some of the FBI spokespeople, do you have similar relationships with the other social media companies, with Facebook, with Instagram is Facebook, but some of the I can't remember the other ones. And the FBI refused to answer. They said, this is internal communications. This is not something that we can go and put out there. But the implication was that they are involved with a lot of social media companies, because it's not just about the content. It's about things, like patterns of communication. Let's say that a Facebook user is involved or watching a lot of white supremacist videos, and then goes and starts watching a lot of some videos on local schools. That would be a really important relationship for someone to be able to make the connection to. The FBI might have an interest in knowing some of those patterns. Are someone getting access to content that is of a violent nature, and then something that might sort of look like research where one might want to go and commit a violent crime? And so the FBI would have an interest in that, and the regular media companies would not have access to that kind of information, but the social media companies would.
So, Brian, would you be okay with the federal government, without a warrant, looking at your credit card, going to the credit card companies and saying, well, what is Brian buying? I want to see where he's spending his money. What is he? I want to get some information about what he's watching on TV. I mean, it's just that's a better comparison. I think they're going without a warrant to just pull up information that people, if they wanted to search it themselves, I guess they could. But to go to companies and start pulling this information, there's at least some correlation there where it makes people nervous to say, hey, this is an invasion of privacy. And when you said before that they weren't trying to control information, they absolutely are. I mean, here's an example. They're saying, hey, the FBI San Francisco is notifying you of the below account activities, which may potentially, you always say, well, maybe they were just saying it was, it's almost as if the verbiage of whatever was on the $3.5 million invoice, or whatever the verbiage was of the request, like that would exonerate the FBI. If they say, well, maybe this constitutes a violation of your terms of service, that isn't enough for me, because once again, there's an implied threat there. They're carrying a big stick. They're paying a ton of money to you. And when they are trying to look at certain accounts and suppress them and say, look at these people, this is a violation of terms of service. And then later, if let's say Twitter does nothing, and then something happens and the FBI says, we told them to suppress these, we told them to look at these people, and they didn't. I think there's definitely an implied threat there. And some of this stuff is, that the FBI was getting involved with, they're just jokes. One of them, that email I was just reading to you about, hey, these may violate the Twitter's terms of service. This Twitter user posted with a display name Ultra MAGA, stated the following: Americans vote today. Democrats, you vote Wednesday the 9th, which was after the election.
Right.
And it was a guy obviously making a joke.
Is it obvious?
Twitter. Yeah. Yes.
Why is it obvious?
Because he says Americans vote today, but Democrats vote tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
So is somebody reading that going to be like, oh, I guess everybody votes today except for Democrats. We have to vote tomorrow. That doesn't seem like a joke to you?
To me, it's, I mean, you take the name of the account, you take the languaging on it. Yes, I wouldn't consider it a joke. I would consider it, in bad taste, but I wouldn't take it as something real. But let's, if, for example, our mother had seen that, do you think she would look at it and go, oh, obviously this doesn't make a lot of sense? I wouldn't. That's not true. Or do you think she might get swayed? Like, well, maybe there are two different voting days for different people, the Republicans and the Democrats. Now, of course, it said Americans, but there are some people that will skip over some of the content. And that was why, I mean, is it obvious a joke? Yeah, probably, but not to everybody. And if it makes people vote on the wrong day, that's pretty serious. Or trying to vote on the wrong day.
Maybe they shouldn't be voting if they can't realize that everybody votes on the same day. But I don't know, Brian. I guess this is the concern that people have, is that the federal government would be going in and saying, well, that's not enough of a joke, or that's too much of a joke. That's the concern. And if
Sure.
you don't think that's a concern, then you're just that's what you're disagreeing with. So you can talk past it and say, well, they have, this isn't really serious stuff. Well, they think it is, and here's why they do. Because they're worried about the fact that the federal government is going in, and then the concern becomes, well, are they looking just at one side of the aisle? Are they, if a Democrat made a joke, would they look at it differently? Or if they were Republican FBI operative, and they would they look at, be harder on the Democratic side? Like, they should just stay out of this stuff. They should not worry too much about jokes. People sometimes get misinformation. If you get if that's the type of joke that you can't understand, or you can't see that that doesn't make any sense, I'm sorry, you could look it up. I don't know. Some ultra MAGA user tells you the Democrats vote tomorrow, and you're not going to go look at the date yourself. It just seems like a bit of a stretch that the federal government should be paying to figure out how to suppress that type of stuff. Just get out of there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, perhaps, and I think it was definitely questionable. We don't have a whole lot of time left, but there was one of the things that bothered me about this whole Twitter files was Matt Taibbi in particular he doesn't have the strongest I guess neutrality. He's not the most neutral writer in some of the stuff that he was putting out there. And of course we talked before about how the way the content was gathered, how there wasn't the ability to go and filter it. You brought up a great point just a moment ago. How were the Democrats being as filtered as the Republicans were? And unfortunately, because of the way they were getting the information, it was really hard to go and to get broader information. If you're looking at something, like any tweet that has MAGA in it, but how do you make the same categorization on the Democrat side? So the information is going to be based on the filters that you set out there. There was. Well, before I go on to we got about 5 minutes left. Is there anything else that you wanted to comment on, Matt? So before I move on.
Yeah, I guess even if you had full access to the information, well, let's say both you and I had, independent of each other, full access to the information, we would have a different opinion on the percentage of right-leaning accounts that were suppressed as opposed to the left-leaning. And because we would have different opinions on what really deserved to be a violation, what didn't. I mean, we've talked about this before. That's why they should just stay out of this, because you come to these decisions about whether to suppress something or what is misinformation with all of your preconceived ideas about what is true and what isn't. It becomes just about impossible for. I mean, do you disagree that if we looked at it, we would have different opinions about whether the FBI had suppressed more left-leaning or more right-leaning accounts? Wouldn't we, if we had the same access to the same information, wouldn't we disagree on that?
I think it'd be really difficult to be able to. I mean, it'd take a lot of time. I guess you could probably go through and filter through all the different accounts that they had suggested to Twitter, and then go on and look at all the accounts and determine the accounts that are far right and far left. They are very obvious which way they lean, but as you get more towards the middle, it becomes a little more challenging, like most of the stuff that we discuss.
Sure, Brian, but given unlimited time, we would disagree. That's the whole point. Given unlimited time, we would disagree. If we went through and looked at all of it and tried to, tally it up somehow, we would disagree. And because there's not one truth in a lot of these different things, there are certain things that we can agree upon. But sometimes I'm going to say, well, that's clearly a joke. It's not a big deal. And you're going to say, no, that could be dangerous to somebody who's not that bright or something like that. We're going to disagree on what should be allowed and what shouldn't, what was a justified suppression and what wasn't, which way the people that were being suppressed actually leaned. We would never agree on it.
Yeah.
And so I think when that happens, and especially when the FBI isn't involved in looking at personal information like this, they don't have warrants to do this type of stuff. Just stay out of it. They shouldn't be involved in this.
Well, yeah, and it does bring up the point that you and I really can't answer, which is how much of this type of work, how much of it is actually requiring of a warrant. If Facebook and Twitter are selling some of the data to any private company that wants to pay for it, if the FBI has essentially access to the same information, then there's nothing illegal that's happening. But if they're going beyond that, if they're using the authority that they have as a representative of the federal government, as an investigating body, and using that to apply a little bit of pressure, then they're absolutely wrong. And let me say that although you and I disagree on little bits and pieces, I do agree with you that there was potential for bad acting, that there may have even been some bad acting going on, and that the FBI needs to be very careful in those situations that they toe the line, because they are law enforcement, and it's easy to get to take that sort of power and run too far with it.
Yeah, especially you and I talked a little while ago about how there was a story about the Indian Prime Minister, and they asked Twitter to suppress the story, and you said that was inappropriate. I mean, that's a great example. Like what we say is, well, when the government, what I say is they should stay out of this completely. What you say is they can get involved as long as they don't go too far. As long as they toe the line, as you put it. And the problem that I have with that is you just never know who the next guy in charge is going to be. Is it going to be Barack Obama, Joe Biden, or Donald Trump? Like, let's just have these guys stay out of it, because and similarly, is it going to be is it going to be an FBI agent that's along those lines? Which one of those people are we going to get? So just stay out of it, because I don't want them to get involved in this stuff. There's too much power that they have. There's too much of an implied threat. And once they step over the line, how do we bring them back?
Right.
It's not like we just vote for somebody different.
And the only reason why we know about this is because someone went through and dug it out and allowed it to be out there in the open. And the one thing that I do give Elon Musk credit for is allowing this sort of thing to happen. Now, he did have a bit of a motive, because he wanted to make the previous owners look bad and him look good. But at the same time, he gave the access. And if he hadn't done that, we wouldn't have had this information. So in that sense, I do want to thank him for it.
$44 billion well spent.
Yeah. All right, so we got to call it done there. What do we say the next one's going to be? Oh, AI. We're going to talk about artificial intelligence. We're going to figure out a way to break it up into some smaller chunks, and so give some thought to that. And we'll talk again next week.
Okay.
Thanks, Colin.
All right.
We hope you learned something in this episode of Brother versus Brother, a podcast about difficult conversations. We also hope that you enjoyed it enough to subscribe to the podcast. You can help us by spreading the word. Share this episode on your favorite social media so that others will have an opportunity to experience it as well. You can also support us by donating through Patreon. This information and more can be found on our website, broconvo.com, and on our various social media accounts. Thank you.